Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming today. We're going to go over data management. In particular, we're going to focus on how to share data, some of the mandates that people with grants have to share it, and then repositories where that's available. So before I begin, I guess I have a question. What is it that you feel like you need to know about data management at this point?
What the library's role might be.
Okay, so Ken wants to know what the library's role may be in data management. You know, that would be a good thing to determine, yes. Yes, Bruce?
Where do we have this information on our website?
Where do we
have access to this knowledge?
Oh, okay. How can we get to this information through our website? Okay. There is a data management page that Amy had created. I can forward the notes to her and she could decide what she wants to do with them. But yeah, I mean, there definitely should be more available to everybody. So make these notes more available. All right. Well, the first part of our data management series had to do with data management plans, their purpose, and then it also went over how libraries can be involved in data management plans and then components of that. I do have the archive and the PowerPoints from that previous workshop that I sent to everyone last night, so you'll all have access to that information. This time we're going to step a little forward and define data sharing and how that's going to look. We're going to describe the benefits and challenges of data sharing because, well, it's a nice idea in practice, but what are some of the realities that are a part of it? Then we'll go into the mandates for data management plans and data sharing. Some of the federal government grants have requirements that the people who are grant recipients share their data and their information, and we'll introduce some of those requirements. Then we'll go into some best practices in data sharing and then identify some data journals, data papers, and data repositories where people can put their data. Okay, so just a quick review. What is data management? It's defined as the organization, storage, access, and preservation of data. So whether you save it in a paper form or an electronic form in a file like a spreadsheet, or even visual records can be data. It's the organization and storage of all that. One of the reasons why the libraries are starting to become increasingly involved in that is that it's seen as another application and extension of fundamental library tasks that we already do, particularly with instruction, access to information, storage, and even some technical parts of data storage. Some of the main library services in data management can include advising professors and researchers and perhaps even graduate students about data management practices. We can help them curate the data, ideally, and then we could also provide instruction about that. Now, I'm not suggesting or recommending we do this next week, as I mentioned earlier, but really this is just to give you an overview of how we can begin. A data management plan is a pretty key part of a data management. That's going to be a written document that describes how data is going to be collected and generated throughout a research. And it also includes how they're going to take care of the data once the research is done and even how to distribute it. And more information about data management plans was available in the first workshop in February. Data management has a life cycle that begins with its design. You first design the study you're going to do, and then you plan the study. The middle part is going to be the collection of the data and how to analyze it. During that particular interchangeable cycle of the data management life cycle, that's where you collaborate with other researchers to gather data, you store the data and information. You also secure it, that is, so it might not get hacked or maybe personal or private information stays that way. And then you make backups of all of that. Then the next step is to transform the data so that you could preserve it, that is, store it somewhere or share it or publish it. And then finally, you could reuse the data. A lot of times data will be used by researchers to validate some studies that they want to do if they use a very similar design and have a similar hypothesis for a research question. This is the Carnegie Mellon University Library's example of a data management lifecycle. There's a lot more that are out there, but they all pretty much have very similar components of the lifecycle. Today's focus is going to be on preserving and sharing the data. So just to give you a couple examples of data management, I was able to find some that we could take a look at. Here is where the researchers created their data management plan that they provided to their funders. I'll try this data proficiency across the disciplines as an example. Okay, it didn't have its caffeine yet. So the computer did now. I might have to. All right, so here's an example of a data management plan provided by someone named Harrison Decker, who did this for the National Science Foundation. In the second page, he describes the data that he expects to generate in his project, how long he plans to keep it. He also shows where he's going to store it. Looks like he may put it on a data storage site called GitHub, and also the University of Rhode Island will be consulted to determine how to retain it. Then he'll describe the data format it's going to be in, so it looks like he's going to be using ASCII files and LaTeX. And then he describes further about the storage and preservation and any possible requirements. Now this is really a summary of the data management plan that people are often required by certain agencies to give to them as proof of how they plan to manage their data. So any questions before I go into sharing data? Yes?
So you said that this is generally a summary, so like that was 2 pages, so then within the actual document, physical document itself that they created digital, they're going to have a much more detailed explanation.
Ideally, yes. Yes. I mean, the federal agencies are all over the map about how detailed it has to be. So a lot of times we'll see just this information, and sometimes we'll see a lot more.
Is the format for the plan usually set by the funding agency or by the institution? How does that work?
The agency will usually have a format that they want to see for certain elements of information they want included in a data management plan. But we'll be going into a bit of that when we go over the different agencies and some of their mandates. So, all right, good questions. Any others so far? Okay. All right, so next we'll go into data sharing. So what is data sharing? Data sharing is distributing research data so it can be available within a discipline to the broader public or to both. I did a study on the use of the library among STEM majors here, and I do have a lot of data from that, from 332 people who participated in that study. So if I want, I can actually take all that data and share it with other people so that they can do similar studies if they want to. Data sharing is going to be done through a variety of means, so there's a lot of different ways that I could share the data, which we'll describe shortly. Data sharing can be used to inform. The public really wants to know how their money's being spent. So a lot of it has to do with documentation of what research is being done, how it's being done, and just for overall transparency. Before I go on, Ali, can you hear me okay? Okay, because I just want to make sure the fans didn't drown me out. Okay, thank you. All right. Data sharing can also be applied to teaching, instruction, and to research. So a lot of times you can take data sets that people have shared or made public, and you could use those to teach data management to students or graduates or even ourselves. We could do instruction with data, such as what we're doing similarly to now, and then data sharing is very frequently applied in research. So one thing that I could have done for my research study on STEM student use of the library was maybe I could have looked around for similar studies to see what their data had come up with and maybe compare mine or validate mine and so forth. But data sharing is at this time an emerging topic. It's really only been the past few years that this has been discussed more and more. When Obama was president, he really advocated open science and public access to information. So I think that was really the beginning, and we're going to be seeing a bit more about this in the days to come. Much has yet to be studied on its impact, so we're not really sure how it's impacting researcher data as of yet. But I'm pretty sure that's going to be studied by people and information scientists. Okay, so why share data? There are some benefits to research as well as to the researchers to share data. One thing that the National Science Foundation and the Human Genome Project stated was that sharing data helps reinforce scientific inquiry. It can lead to discoveries and also contributions. Just to give you an example of the Human Genome Project, that was a massive study going from 1990 to 2003. It aimed to sequence the entire human genome, complete set of genes. And they wanted to do this initially to understand the genetic changes that cause cancer, and also to study long-term DNA damage caused by radiation. So what they did was they collected the genes of thousands of people around the world so they could do it. So it was a multinational collaborative effort. And all this data was shared to find a lot of information and discoveries. The main outcome was that they discovered that humans have fewer genes than they suspected, so we're not as full of them as they thought, but what we do have are far more complex than what they thought. So the data sharing was something that was a very big part of the Human Genome Project and all the discoveries and inventions that came about through that. Another benefit is that sharing data accelerates research and innovations. That was another big emphasis on the Obama administration. Research is very competitive, like it or not. We are a university. We have to get certain rankings. Our professors have to produce and so forth. So ideally, data will help move that along. Data can also be used to reproduce or validate studies. So if you do a study and you take a look at the data of a very similar study and you have similar results, okay, well, you're more likely to have a valid result from yours. In a way, it's a response to the replicability crisis that we have now. Are you familiar with the that particular thing that's happening in academia? Replicability crisis? Oh, okay. Well, two scientists, I believe they were social scientists, did research about 3 years ago. They repeated a lot of different studies published in journals, and they found that a very small percentage provided valid outcomes. That is, their conclusions were valid. They reproduced some of the studies again and again, and they did not get the same results. So it really caused a huge ripple in the academic community. Is the research that people doing really valid, truthful, if it can't be reproduced or replicated? So ideally, the data sharing would help, with this and help, determine if a study is valid or not. Unfortunately, the people who are anti, higher ed and anti-research are using this replicability crisis to say, well, maybe you don't need as much money as we give you. So unfortunately, that's what's happening right now in higher ed and the research world. All right, so going on that, quality data can also be integrated into a research study that collects the same type of data. So you can have your own pool of data that you're collecting, but if you find a similar study or, or even an identical study, you can add that data with permissions, of course, to get like a stronger power. That is, like if you have a larger a larger sample size or more samples even, chances are you may have a more accurate result. If you study too few people or too few sample size or too few samples, you can't really generalize from those results. Sharing data ideally improves a study's discoverability. So the idea is that if you post your data, other people can find it and then maybe perhaps read your article or read your presentations about it and maybe they'll get cited more. And yes, it may help increase citation counts as data sharing increases. So those are the main benefits about sharing data. Does anyone have any questions? Did the people in the PhD programs or who survived them had anything to add to this? So, okay, so you all have more experience with that, but I just thought I'd ask. Okay. Another reason to share data is mandates, and that's probably going to be the biggest thing that compels researchers to have a data management plan and to share data. Some funders will have data sharing requirements, and we'll go into ones that do. Funders have increased pressure for transparency and to show returns on investment. So the NSF is going to give a researcher $500,000 for a grant. They want to know what happened with it and what information came about it. The other reason is that available funding is expected to be flat or decrease in the near future for research. So I think that's going to mean increased competition for grants and that people better have a pretty good plan in place so that they can make their their grant more competitive with so many more other people who are competing for the same money. So mandates are going to be a reason for sharing data. Also, some journals may require authors of accepted articles to make their data publicly accessible. So there are some scientific journals out there that do require that the authors put their data somewhere so that people can find it and look at it. We'll have some more information about that when I go into data journals here. And then a third reason for sharing data will be the public good. So it's going to leverage the results of some publicly funded research. People may take that information, go invent some things. I think it's called the Bayh-Dole Act in the federal government that allows entrepreneurs to make inventions based on federally funded projects and not have to pay necessarily, not have to pay a royalty for that. So, what's that?
Can I just add something?
Sure.
Because it happens to be out.
Yeah.
That's remember one of my areas asked me for information about what a poster law is.
Oh.
And I think that kind of has implications for funding.
Oh.
Because it's going to be flat or lower.
Yeah.
But researchers now have to take money that they normally use for the researchers and pay graduates to use to analyze data or whatever, or to collect data, to have their data hosted. So it's less money for the research in the name of sharing. I know that I don't disagree with sharing, but it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just sharing an experience like that.
Okay, so just to summarize what you said, I don't know how well the recording picked it up, but somebody wanted to share data, but to host it would have to take money out of their grant to do that, and it might be less money that they'll have for the other aspects of the research. And that could be that's definitely a very very real drawback to all that too, especially in the light of decreasing funding. Also, sharing data ideally will build public trust. Like I said, science and a lot of intellectual activities have been under assault for quite some time. So ideally, if we have some good information that can be shared, that may restore some of the confidence. Now, going into some challenges in data sharing, I'm not going to be here and say, come on, we're all going to share data. It's great. It's going to make America a better place. We're going to become a top-tier institution if we do it. No, I want to give you a little reality, in this part too. A big challenge in data sharing is going to be privacy, confidentiality, and security. Private data, such as personal health data and personal identifiers, will definitely be a matter that will have to be addressed if you decide to share the data. How are you going to anonymize the names, and other identified information for people who participate in the study? This is especially true if you're studying a sensitive topic like maybe some behaviors, smoking, drug use, sexual activity, perhaps illegal activities and so forth. Maybe you're interviewing people on a sensitive topic or some events. How are you going to handle all the data and information that is generated from that without implicating somebody or embarrassing them possibly, if that data got out? Competitive intelligence and intellectual property issues are one big reasons why some of the researchers I've talked to here don't really want to share their data. They don't want to get scooped. They don't want a researcher to come in, take a look at their study, and basically get their information published before they could. So they don't, like I said, it's competitive. So people feel that sometimes data sharing may disable their competition in a lot of ways. Another challenge in data sharing will be restricted data. There are some data sets that cannot be distributed to the general public. There are, like the ones I mentioned, that have a lot of private data. There's also the reasons like confidentiality of the people who participate. There may be also licensing or use agreements that may be a challenge in data sharing. Like if you're using a proprietary software that someone else had done and you're paying for it, you might not be able to share the data as easily. You might have to take a look at the licenses that are attached to whatever you're using. And then also there's national security considerations too, believe it or not. I know that a lot of people, since 9/11, they've been putting public work data and maps more harder to get and not as publicly available for those reasons. There's also challenges in data sharing for the researchers. I like this image, and that kind of says it all. Right now, there's really not many incentives for data sharing other than a lot of the mandates, and it would be nice. It really doesn't, it's not considered as strongly for promotion and tenure at this time. Preparing data for sharing can be very time consuming, so it can take a long time for people to take their data sets and make them presentable, so to speak, or add them to some sort of repository to get that stored. And also measuring the impact of data sharing is a work in progress, so we don't really know right now conclusively what data sharing does for a person's citation counts or other bibliometric or research metrics that may be out there. There's also the practicalities of sharing data. Data is as good as its, the quality. If it's bad quality, it's bad data. So we want to make sure that, if the data is going to be shared, it can be easily used. Data is also not treated the same among all the disciplines. Now, a lot of the data sharing and the data management does have a science and empirically based focus right now, but the humanities does collect data, images, text, study in the textual analysis and all that. So visual data and textual data is probably not going to be treated the same as, say, stuff that's been collected in a lab or a field. Generalizations may also be erroneously made from scarce data. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have too small of a sample size or samples or not enough participation in it, you don't want to make, assumptions about things or say that it's true because the data set's just so small or there's not much out there. And another problem too with data sharing is misuse or unknown distribution of data. Just to mention my colleague Lori, who had a workshop on images, she noticed that she had a conundrum that she wanted to use an image, but she wasn't sure if it was the original. Was that what happened there?
Lots of times, yeah. And with faculty too.
Yeah. So you find something on the internet, maybe it's Creative Commons supposedly, but you're not sure if that's really the original. Yeah. So we have that issue with data as well. You don't know where it really originated, which is known as its provenance. And then also you don't know how it's being used either. So that's going to be another challenge that researchers are very, very keen on, and really want that to be addressed. Another challenge in data sharing will be ownership and stewardship. So who has the rights to publish the data and who has the copyright? In other words, who owns it? That's going to be a little problematic at times, especially for multi-institution teams that are doing a research project. Who gets to say the data is theirs and how can they use it? And that goes along with determining who owns the data and is responsible for its storage and maintaining it. Confidentiality, privacy, and security are some ways that we can, now we're going to go to responses to challenges. Privacy, confidentiality, and security can be addressed by anonymizing or redacting the data. We probably heard about the famous Mueller report, redactions. We could do that to data too. We could just cross it out and you can't see it. You could also take the identifiers out of a data set too, so that people cannot be identified. I think it was an information scientist in the 90s who determined that all you need is your age, your gender, your zip code, and one other thing to determine who you are. So if somebody wanted to know if I were in a study and my age, gender, zip code, and I forgot the fourth thing was included, they can say, oh, that's Christy Padron. And oh, she has high blood pressure and she doesn't eat right. Oh, so yeah. You can anonymize the data, so you can say this is a female in her 40s that lives in Southeast Florida, so that it's not as easy to track an individual. So in terms of issues for researchers, creating a data management plan is always ideal at the beginning of research. Now, I will say it is very time-consuming, but it's really important to have that blueprint about how to proceed. Another response to challenges that researchers may face is that data sharing impact measurements may increase as more researchers do this and as data citation counts improve. So as I said before, it's just the beginning. So as more people may do this, maybe then we'll get more conclusive information about how data may impact bibliometrics or other research methods. Also, in terms of sharing the data, researchers can self-distribute the data. That is, they can go to a conference and tell people where it is. They could put it on their Twitter feed or other social media. And they may even include some conditions for use. In terms of practicalities, the data management plan will help a researcher address quality issues and also how to review the data during the research and to see if anything might need to be tweaked. And finally, in terms of ownership and stewardship, they'll have to have the hard discussion of determining who owns it and who's going to be responsible for taking care of the data. And that should be put in the data management plan. And then once it's time to share the data, if it's decided, they can review the policies of data repositories and data journals to see what they can do to keep on maintaining the data. All right, so that was a lot of information. Was there any thoughts or questions about what was shared so far? Yes.
So you were talking about possibly having conditions for use of data in the prior slide. So is that like along the lines of, say, Creative Commons, where you could use something, but you have to give attribution, or you could use, but maybe you have to share in a certain way or can't do commercial use? So potential for that type of thing.
Yeah, I did see some data with Creative Commons licenses when I was looking around and preparing for this. So that's one condition that could be added. Another condition, there's something called data enclaves, that is where they give you data, but you have to be a certain kind of researcher. You have to demonstrate that the research you're going to do is relevant, and that and that's how they'll determine if you can get the data. So that's another way that permissions could be done too.
So it can be more restricted.
Yeah. Yep. And I'll go into an example for that. Yeah, good question. All right, so we can do a little activity called, can this data be shared? So in light of what we talked about with confidentiality, issues of sharing, I provided a fictitious, well, not entirely fictitious data set. So this is an NSF-funded study of problematic behaviors in pets. Can this data as it appears go public? If so, what should be considered? And to give us a little, to get our minds going, here's the species of different animals that are pets. Then we've got the name of the pet, their gender, if they're spayed, neutered, or neither, and when they were born, the problematic behaviors, who owns them, and where they live. Okay, so my 10-year-old dog, Marley, likes to chew furnishings, and she really did destroy some rugs. Not a nice dog in that respect. And I've had her for almost 9 years. And then you have other pets that were studied, then their problematic behaviors. All right, so if this data goes public, how might it affect me? Because it's got my name and my dog and my city on it. What are some, yes?
Well, if there are people who are looking to target certain breeds of dogs, and they know now they have your name and where you live, they can kind of begin to correlate the address and also find laws and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, if somebody wants to misuse the data and say dachshunds are bad pets because they do things, that's definitely an issue there about, posting the data. Yes, Brian?
I would see in the second one, pit bull and bites frequently. People can see that they could target them for legal liabilities. You could be denied insurance, possibly, because of those things.
Yeah, so Richard Roberts might have a problem with his insurance because he has a dog that bites a lot. And this document shows that Rex has a problem with biting, so if Richard Roberts gets in trouble, legal trouble, because the dog bites people, it's documented right there. His case is going to be weakened in court, to defend himself and his dog. Let's see. So we got some legal issues, insurance issues, misuse of the data. Yes, Lori?
You also, like for Simba the tiger, there was he allowed in the U.S. Legally, does T. Montana live in an area that allows exotic pets? And what are the regulations for this particular area that he lives in with regard to caging of animals and protecting people, seeing as he escapes from breeding?
Yeah, you definitely have the issue of the animal rights. If the animal has the legal papers and registered, if the municipality allows it, and if T. Montana is in fact doing the proper care of the tiger, especially if it escapes a lot. So, yeah, so there's a lot of issues that would come up if I shared this information. And I'll probably get a nice, if I owned Rex, I'll probably get a statement from Progressive Insurance saying my house insurance just went up about 50% or whatever. So, all right.
It might get spammed by chewy.com.
Oh gosh, that too. Yeah, since we're all pet owners, we could, they could find our email somehow and, spam us. That's very true. So what are some things that I could do to make this more presentable to share that might not have all these issues, that the data won't have as many issues? Okay, so, you could just say a female from Delray Beach owns my little brat, my dog. Probably one thing that they often said about cities is just instead of doing a city, maybe like a region, Palm Beach County, maybe Southeast Florida, or even just Florida if I'm doing like a national type study. Probably take out the name of the pet as well, and not have a picture of my dog there, with that sign that condemns her. But, all right, but those are some of the issues that would need to be considered when making this information public. I got the Maine Coon because one of our librarians was just fascinated by them for a while. So, okay, so next we're going to go into some mandates and recommendations. And this is probably where you all may be fielding some questions. I'm not going to go super deep into the detail. What I will provide, though, are some of the main federal agencies and their take on the mandates for sharing and their recommendations. I also provide links to all of that information in the PowerPoint so that you can go back and review that and see what they are specifically asking for. And a lot of times they'll give you more background information too. So a lot of this really started with the NSF. In their proposal and awards policies and procedures guide, they do provide a data sharing policy. And they say that grantees are expected to encourage and facilitate such sharing. They do have data management plan requirements, and in their Chapter 2, Part C of that PAPPG, they go into that in more detail. Also, there's a lot of different branches within the NSF. It's a huge agency. So there are many directorates, offices, divisions, programs, and other units. They may have variations or takes on their data management plans. So if somebody with an NSF grant has a question for you, it might be good to ask what office within the NSF awarded the grant. The most PPAG addresses intellectual property and policy issues. I will also add that these policies do change with some regularity, so it's always good to check them out to see what's the current state of affairs there. The National Institute of Health also has some recommendations and guidance. They have a document called the Data Sharing Policy and Implementation Guidance. National Institute of Health does not require a data management plan, but they do have documents that encourage the data sharing. Their data sharing policy affects grants greater than $500,000 in any year of the proposed research. So what that means is that if a researcher has a grant for that amount of money and he or she anticipates doing that research within the calendar year, they will be required by NIH to share the data. However, if it's a $500K grant going over a span of 4 or 5 years, they may not have that mandate. You know, it's going to be if $500,000 will be spent within a year of the research as opposed to a multi-year. The NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, does have some data management plans required for certain branches of their and also certain grants that they have. One example is the Digital Humanities Implementation Grants and Advancement Grants has a requirement there. Their proposals and awards executive summary provide that information. They also have another grant called the Research and Development Grants, and they encourage people to communicate the results of the work and that they should make the research data publicly available if possible. What I'll do is I'll just go to this one to give you an example. So here's the NEH Office of Digital Humanities executive summary for their data management plan. Okay, it's like a whole 3 pages. So it looks like they want a DMP to be short, no more than 2 pages, and for it to supplement a grant application and to address 2 topics. What data will your research generate, and what is your plan for managing the data? And then they go into more detail about what it is they'd like to see in their data management plan and data sharing. The Institute for Museums and Library Services does have a National Leadership Grant for libraries. in their grant proposals, they don't necessarily have a data management plan, but they do want to see a data summary for one particular grant that they have. They do have some other guidance for data sharing and data management as well. It looks like they have one for projects that develop digital products. They ask for an explanation of how a grantee will manage, share, preserve, and document information and what is created as a result of the research. And it looks like for projects that develop digital products, if data is collected or analyzed, a DMP is required, along with depositing data in a broadly accessible repository. So they want you not only to have a data plan, but they want to have it be shared and to make it very available to people. So, all right, so any questions so far about the mandates? So looking at the mandates will require a little bit of homework on our part to see what's current and what the specific ones may be. The data management plans will usually go with the grant application, and that will describe how they plan to share the data if there is that requirement. Now, other federal agencies may have some data sharing or data management plan mandates, so I would recommend to go to the agency or funder's documentation, whether it's a web page or a manual, or even if you contact the grants office or their grants administrator to see where you could get that information. Spark has a page called Data Sharing Requirements by Agency, and that's where they have links to the various major funders. That's to help you identify and compare current and anticipated data sharing policies. And like I said, it also includes other funders like USAID that does a lot of international work, Food and Drug Administration, and others. I'll go to that page. We can see that. All right, so this is the Spark page. They give us the icons of the different agencies that we have. Okay, so I think we can go into a particular one. I'll try the Department of Education. Okay. So it looks like they provide the current data management, data sharing information. And then links to their data, you know, their policies there. And it looks like they do have a statement about when data should be publicly shared, and links to the documentation that provide more detail. So Spark has that page that would be very helpful if you need like a quick reference for data sharing requirements. All right, so next we're going to go into repositories, that is how data can be shared and distributed. There are some broader ways of sharing data. The primary investigator could do it, or his or her team. They can go do presentations or other means of communication. Maybe they do a poster presentation, talk about their research, and provide information where people can get their data. Perhaps they publish a white paper, so maybe they do a report as opposed to a peer-reviewed article, or maybe they're not quite there yet. The primary investigator could also make their data available on request so people can email them. And then one example that we have is social media. For instance, Chris Salinas, who's an assistant professor in the College of Education, shares a lot of his research activities on his Twitter feed. Another way to share the data would be through archives and repositories. Now, they're not all necessarily identical or built the same. There's a lot of fine differences between the different types that are out there. The broader types of archives and repositories would be like a data archive, and that's going to be where the machine-readable data is, let's see, acquired, manipulated, documented, and distributed for the professional community for further analysis. So, data archive, where people can go and download data. Archives and repositories could also be institutional. So, let's see, it looks like the United Kingdom government has their own data repository on the page. That's on the top, the image there, that's like the top one here. But that's a collection of a lot of the data that is undertaken by the British government. Data could also be shared in discipline-specific archives or repositories. Trolling was one quick example, called the Tromsø Repository of Language and Linguistics. It's hosted on Dataverse, which is a repository in Norway. But people who are studying, I think Scandinavian languages and linguistics will store that information there. And then you have a lot of cross-disciplinary repositories and archives that will save just about anything. Amazon Web Services has a registry of open data where people can collect data from other studies. Now, there are some special types of archives or repositories, especially those that address the confidentiality or conditions that people may want or need to have with their data. A data enclave is a controlled, secure environment in which eligible researchers can perform analyses using restricted data sources. I found a lot of these in the health sciences that have people's information. So scientists and other researchers can get some information, but people who state their case may be able to get the full data set. The ICPSR Data Enclave has an example called the 500 Family Study that was done in the late 90s here. Okay, I thought that this went directly to the study, but here is their, the ICPSR's description of the data enclaves that they have and the various types of data that they could collect. So it looks like they can also collect geospatial data as well. But I thought that I was going to get to the description of that study. But just to describe the particular study, it's in this data enclave. Some but not all of the data for this study was restricted. It was a study that was designed to get in-depth information on middle-class dual-career families living in the US. The study was done to understand the complex dynamics in today's families and the strategies that people and families use to balance work and family life. So over 500 families from across the US, 8 cities specifically were studied. And the data in that data set includes their cortisol levels, which is often a physiological indicator of stress, consumption of substances, so alcohol, perhaps prescriptions, medications. They also collected some psychological and health data, basic demographic information, and then some other data like family work conflict. They had, I guess, some interviews or narratives describing that. Parental attitudes. Are people more, who was for or still used corporal punishment, who was more permissive with their kids. And then they also had data on kids, especially teenagers, which is already protected data because they're minors. So information and data from the study is available, but not all of it is going to be included. All right, so when sharing data, there are some points to consider in selecting how you want to share it. Institutional policies was mentioned earlier in this presentation as a question. You'll definitely want to take a look at your department or your institution's policy about sharing data. Yes, no, maybe so. If you decide to put it in a repository or archive, you want to take a look at their reputation, like how established are they, how long have they been around, how well is it being maintained. You can also take a look at the access, that is, how easy will people be able to find the information. You also want to take a look at the safety and legality of storage. So if you're going to be putting personal health information or very sensitive data, how safe is that information going to be if you decide to put it into a repository? And then also, this goes along with data. How do you track and analyze data use? So how many people are using this data, especially in this day where you have to measure and quantify just about everything, it feels like sometimes. So those are going to be some of the main points in selecting how people want to share their data. There are some data sharing publications that are out there. Right now, it's mostly in the sciences, like Elsevier has a journal called Data in Brief. Oxford University Press has GigaScience. Nature has a scientific data journal where people just put their data there. And then Ubiquity Press has one called the Journal of Open Humanities Data. So there is some humanities journals out there, data journals that are out there. Data can also be shared by having a data paper and also having a data report. And I'll try the data report. So this is their civil rights data collection. Looks like they collect student information like enrollment, education programs and services. And it looks like they use that information for monitoring and where help may be needed. But here they have links to where you can get to the data sets. And then you've got a data report that they issued for 2015-2016. And it looks like they provide multi-years, and also the survey forms and what data they collected. Yeah. So this was one done by the Department of Education to monitor the students in American public schools. All right, so now to go into some best practices in data sharing. Data management's an important component of that, especially to create or follow a data management plan. They do know for sure that when a data management plan is created, that data is more likely to be successfully shared, especially if this is all done in the early process of the research. Another practice in data sharing is to review the quality of the data throughout the research and then before you decide to archive it. When I did my study, I had to take a look at my data and I had to clean it up a bit and I had to label it so that it would be understandable for people to read it. I was asked to give my data to Carol and Amy, who do assessment, so I did have to repackage the data I collected so that they could read it and understand what I was giving them. Another best practice is to redact or anonymize the data. So like in that problematic pet behavior study, we can take out the names, the locations of people and pets. And then also, you can decide what data will be most useful to share. Not all data necessarily has to be shared. I'd say to determine what to share, what are the hot topics, what are some emerging topics. It's kind of like information, we know that a lot of the information out there isn't valid or useful. Same with data. Discoverability is another best practice in data sharing. I mean, if you want to share the data, you definitely want to make sure people can find it. Creating a citation is one way that you could have attribution on your data. The Data 1 page shows a really good examples and practices of how to make a citation for your data so it could be found. You'll also choose the metadata so that if people do a keyword in a search engine, they'd be able to find your data. There's a lot of metadata tools that are out there, and they recommend to just practice good metadata principles when you do that. And then when you publish the data, you can identify some archives, repositories, or data journals, or maybe you'll decide all you need to do is to publish a paper or a report, like what we had seen with the Department of Education. All right. Okay. All right, so were there any final questions about data sharing? Yes?
Sorry to have so many questions here. You mentioned machine readable data.
Mm-hmm.
What is considered machine readable data?
Machine readable data. I don't know. I think it has to do with format. Yeah, and that definitely goes into some of the artificial intelligence and data mining things. But, yeah.
And then you talked about selecting data repositories and reputation. How would one go about doing that? Is it something that's now based upon the area that you're in, or would you be looking to see if they've ever had their data breached, or just what would you look for?
I'm going to go to the ICPSR page here. One of the things that I would recommend is taking a look at about, let me see, like who's the, okay, so who's the are they sponsored by an institution? How long have they been around? ICPSR is a very established repository, and it looks like it's a consortium of over 750 academic institutions, and I believe it's housed in our home state of Michigan, Ann Arbor to be exact. But you can find out about their organization on their webpage, like they're about. It looks like they had a link to their history too. So it looks like they provide data, no pun intended, about how they're being operated, so that may help you determine how well they are. Maybe there's a board of governance. You can find out who are the board of directors or board of advisors and see how well that is, and then see how long it's been in existence. And yeah, it's also true that you could ask other people within a field what may be the best places to deposit the data or have the data be stored. So on the PowerPoint, I do have some directories of data repositories that are out there. The Open Access Directory by Simmons College provides a lot of links to the repositories that are out there. And so does the Directory of Open Access Repositories, which is sponsored by Sherpa, the journal, and open, they do all kinds of things with academic publishing. Then I provide some data repositories, like multidisciplinary ones that are out there, science, humanities, and then the social sciences. Now there's a lot more out there. These are just a few. Data repositories can also be within a particular discipline. There's one for I think anthropology, specifically for anthropology in the social sciences. So you can take a look to see if there's a discipline-specific repository that's out there. Yeah.
Would you assume that these all charge money, or is there kind of uniform policy about cost of data?
No, there's not really a uniform policy. Some do require, and some may not, are very low cost. Yeah. Sherry and then Ken.
In that experience I mentioned earlier, we discovered that Island Run posed, I think, up to 2 gigs of data for free. So on that logic, I think the more data, the larger your data set, the
the more likely you are going to incur a fee.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. You know, if you have a large data set, you'll have a bigger fee. I also noticed that if you have to anonymize or you want to only distribute certain data, that often will have an added cost as well. I've seen that quite a bit. Yeah. Oh, and then another thing too is that some people are writing into their grants data managing. You know, that is increasingly becoming a part of grants, that they want part of the grant to go to the money. I mean, part of the grant to go to paying for storage. Yes. Then Sung Hae.
Just curious, is there any activity in whether it's storage or sharing data?
There is a huge server run. Yeah, I'm not aware of any data sharing going on right now. I do know that there is a huge server that's hosted by OIT in the Division of Research where researchers can house their data for the duration of their research. The details slip my mind, but I was able to find it on the FAU web pages there. I'm not aware of any right now though. Yeah, I'd be interested to see who at FAU is in fact doing these things to share it. Yeah, Ken and then Larry.
At the beginning, you had mentioned that some journals required the authors to share their data.
Yes.
So are those usually open access journals, or do you like the commercial publishers do that also?
It's the commercial publishers. I think the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, one of those two medical journals require the data to be shared. Science magazine requires that authors publish their data or put it there and give recommendations about where that is. Where they could do that. Yeah. The journals that I told you about that were data journals are publisher data. I mean, they're access subscription-based journals. So there are some out there that are open access, but right now it seems to be largely the big publishers that are doing that. Larry.
Well, a couple of things. So when the researcher gets their grant, is the grant dictating where they store the data?
No.
So basically it's left up to the researcher to put it wherever they want.
Correct. Now the grant funders may have certain requirements about storing the data, and it's really left to the interpretation of the researcher about where to put it and where to put that information.
Okay. And the other part was there's more, obviously the researchers usually do research at a higher institution, they use a bunch of the resources that are of that institute. Are there institutions, institutions are forcing the researchers to store their data on their repository versus say, you got to give data.gov or any other ones you listed?
I'm not really sure about that. That's probably going to be another emerging topic about our universities and institutions mandating that. I'm not sure.
So it wasn't the whole topic of our resources, and so you have or say something to do with the research you did, tools that we provided.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on data sharing, though, for sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this. If there are no further questions, I will distribute the PowerPoint again and also the recording if you want to see that later on. But this concludes the last of my data management plan series. I finished up my data management training last winter, and let's take it away. Thank you.